because we're breaking somewhat new ground about the future of preservation, and especially how we're going to engage more people. We want this room to be full, right? Full of people who are supporting the places that they care about in our community and in their community. So that's what this project was all about. And I'm delighted to tell you some of the outcomes of this, what I found out as I was working through this fellowship from the James Marston Fitch Foundation out of Columbia University. And some of them are quite surprising. So I just want to tell you, you've heard of trigger warnings, everyone. Some of this is going to be very different than what we've heard about preservation. So I just want to ask you to keep an open mind and to ask you also to write your questions down, or let's get to them at the end and have a robust conversation. So this project, again, the Relevancy Project, has its origins actually many years ago. John was kind in giving me such an honored introduction, everyone. I am from Minnesota. Sorry for the accent. It's still here. I've been in Chicago now for 13 years, but Janelle knows it's still there. Can't get rid of it. But I'm proud to be from this state where I ran the essentially Landmarks Illinois of Minnesota for about 6.5 years. And this was one of our projects called the Schmidt Brewery, very much like a Chicago brewery project. It was abandoned, a long abandoned place that had been abandoned for, I think, close to 2 decades when we took it on as one of our most endangered historic places. Now this tells the story of working people. Working people who came, these are particularly German immigrants who came to St. Paul to work in the brewery. And so this story is very important to labor history. It's very important to the people around the neighborhood who worked there. And we were able to collectively with our other advocates find a developer who was willing to reuse this place. Again, it was abandoned. It was really deteriorating significantly. The developer wanted to turn it into housing, which the community needed, and specifically affordable housing. But when they came to use the federal historic tax credits, which some of you have heard of, what they were met with was a no, a flat out no to reuse this place. And the reason being is that they needed to essentially cut some extra holes. Do you see that wall on the side there? Imagine living in there as an apartment without any windows. Wouldn't have met code, and nobody would have wanted to live there. So instead of, unfortunately, the National Park Service working together with them to find an outcome where they could have reused this entire complex, the answer was no. And the developer walked away. So what I thought to myself at that moment, I became rather disillusioned with this for the first time, this thing I'm so passionate about, historic preservation. Because I said, if we're willing to give up this entire complex and let it rot into the ground because we're so counter to putting a couple of windows into a wall, what are we doing? What are we doing? What is the value of compromise to get the bigger and greater good done? So that happened in 2008. So coming to Landmarks Illinois in 2012, I had that experience, and it just continued to be exacerbated by some of the experiences we had. Some of you may have worked with my colleague Lisa DiChiara, who had been with Landmarks Illinois for 20 years. And together we kept running into the same things over and over again. As John talked about with Broadway, how many of you are frustrated with the lack of political support for historic preservation? Yeah. So those who are watching this on YouTube can't see behind you, but everybody's hand was raised. Both hands were raised. Okay. This is just an illustration for you. One of many stories over my career now, spanning about over 25 years, where you go to a public meeting. This is in Evanston, and that is the city council up there considering the demolition of the Harley Clark Mansion. Some of you might have heard of that effort to save the Harley Clark Mansion. And here, I will tell you, the Harley Clark Mansion is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is a designated Evanston landmark. And it is owned by the city of Evanston. So they were just deciding whether they were going to demolish their own landmark. Do we have to fight for this? Don't we just inherently know about why places are important? The answer is no. Unfortunately, not everybody understands or values places the same way that we do. And it is hard to hear. It is hard to go to these public meetings and consistently hear this pushback about preservation and its value. But we have to listen, because people's perception is their reality about what they believe. And so we consistently have to go time and time again to fight for places. And this I just have to say, was, in our minds ridiculous that we have to fight for a place that is landmarked, that the city owns. Eventually we were able to, with all of these advocates here, make the argument that this place is important, worth saving, and that somebody would want it, because at the time it was vacant. It's now going to become an event center. But I just want to say, this has happened time and time and time again where we have to make this case. And like you, I would raise my hand double to say how frustrating that is. So, essentially, after having this kind of pushback for 25 plus years, the question became, what do we need to do to make preservation matter to more people? Because that is what we need in order to actually do preservation work together. We need more people to care, especially elected officials, but also our neighbors, who are the people who would be helping us save these places. So what do we need to do? That was the genesis of the Relevancy Project, which I'm here to tell you, the Relevancy Guidebook, as I'll show you, was the outcome of that 5-year effort to explore how we make preservation matter more to more people. So relevant, we're going to throw around that term very often, but essentially what we mean by relevant is it's something people see as important to them, something they care about, and something that they're willing to fight for, essentially. That's what we're trying to do for places in our community, is just make more people see the value of them, and that's making it relevant. So in 2019, at Landmarks Illinois, we were preparing for our 50th anniversary in 2021. So we started 2 years in advance to plan for what that was going to be. And instead of deciding to look backward and have a big commemoration, we decided to look forward and use the resources that we had raised to put a plan together for the future. And essentially, as we started asking these questions, what is the challenge? Why do we get so much pushback about preservation? What is happening? What can we do? I essentially said, we need to find out if other people around the country are experiencing the same things that we are. Are we alone? Is it our advocacy work? Is it the way we do our work? Or are other people across the country experiencing the same thing? And so this is what the Relevancy Project was born as essentially environmental scan of the nation to understand if we were alone or if we were having the same issues as everybody else. And so what started in 2019 as this fellowship project with support from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Janelle's old employer, it started out as interviewing about 24 people across the country. And after 3 years, I had interviewed 130 people in the field, adjacent to the field, and also people who don't like preservation. We needed to hear from them. So all of that information I aggregated into the outcomes of this project. But I wasn't alone. There were also others around the country who were studying the same thing. One was Randy Mason, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He and his researchers did essentially a national survey of preservationists to understand what we were thinking and what we were feeling. And he talked to about 2,000 preservationists who answered this study, essentially a survey. And here's what they found. Here's the actual report. If you would like to go and see it, you'll have access to this presentation if you want to go find out for yourself. But here are the key findings, 4 findings. So essentially, across the board, we are frustrated. We are frustrated at how difficult this work is. And the field is ready to evolve. We're ready to say, what do we need to do to be more effective? But we don't know how to do it. Or essentially, there's no agreement on how to do this. And there are thousands of people around the country doing this kind of work professionally, as well as advocating like you, people who do it on their volunteer time. And we just want to know what we need to do, but we disagree on how to do it. So there's the challenge. But we've identified what we can do. And that's what this project essentially was, what we can do. And here are the 8, I'm going to give you the 8 things in just a second, of what we found, aggregating all the data from these 130 interviews. And there was a lot of commonality. But I want to bring you back, before we do that, to the beginnings of preservation. Now, not all the way back. That's Anne Pamela Cunningham and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in the 1860s. I'm talking about the modern preservation movement and that was the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, which created the National Register of Historic Places, as we've talked about today. There was a report that led to that legislation, and it was done by the U.S. Conference of Mayors in relation to, or in response to, urban renewal. Who remembers urban renewal? Or seen the outcomes of urban renewal, right? Whole-scale demolition of neighborhoods, of important places to people. They saw what was happening. They went to Europe to study post-war Europe and see what they had done to either rebuild or save the places that were still left. And that report is fascinating. It's called With Heritage So Rich, and I encourage you to read it. It was republished by the National Trust in, I think, 1996 or 2006 at the 50th anniversary. Fascinating. Here's a quote, though, that I pull out, and I hope right now you've read it. Because what's key here is that preservation didn't start out as saving the window. It didn't start out as saving the doorknob or, the trim. It's to know our history. It says we cannot be the cult of antiquarians. We have to give people a sense of orientation. We have to tell our stories. And especially right now, we're seeing stories being rewritten in a way that we want to make sure we're telling the truth. We want to make sure that we're going back to the archival information, getting the right information out, and telling everybody's story. Does this surprise you? Does this surprise anybody? No? You're like, yeah, that makes sense. Good. Then we're going to have an easy time today. So here's ultimately as I talked with people in the field, you could hear this demand, this need for information on how to change, how to do this work. And so all of that culminated in this book that John mentioned, the Relevancy Guidebook, which is the final book with all this information. It's available for free. We wanted to make sure anybody could access this information at any time. And so we published it as a digital guidebook with resources. It's about 241 pages, and there are essays on each one of the topics I'm going to tell you, so you can delve into them more quickly. There's also an extensive resource guide at the end with about 500 ideas on how to change preservation. I'm going to cover not 500 today, just a few. Here are the big picture items, and I'm going to put this up again at the end, so please know that you're going to see it and we're going to be able to discuss them a little bit further. But here are the 8 topics that came up again and again and again. Number 1, we have become too focused on material and not on people and what people really need in their lives. 2, we are not telling everybody's stories. And that is our job, is to tell the full American story and to include as many people as possible in this work because it's about everybody's communities. And not everybody has access to all of the tools as the same as everybody else. We need more affordable housing across the board, and preservation can have a big, big role in helping to create accessible housing to people. We can fight climate change. You all know the greenest building is?
The one that's standing.
The one that's standing, exactly. So this is a key way that we can add value to this work in our communities on climate change. And more importantly, we don't talk about the health and wellness connections and how being connected to your story, being connected to places is actually good for your mental health, and it's good for your physical health. So I'm going to cover those a little bit today, just a taste. I want you to go and I want you to read more about these things. Okay, this is laying down the gauntlet, and I'm sorry, I know this is really offensive language to people, I'm sorry, but it exemplifies to people outside preservation what we're talking about, that we've made material the focus of what we do. We've made it so precious that it's very difficult for some people to understand why preservation is important because they associate us with the people who say no. That's what we do. I'm going to give you 2 examples, which I hope resonate with you. One is the Frederick Bagley House in Hinsdale. Now, when you look at this, do you think this is a historic house? Yes? No? Okay, we have differing opinions. I'd love to hear the no answer. It looks old, right? It looks old. This house was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So when I say that, do you think this is a historic house? Yes, all right. So you might not say, look at this immediately and say, this is Frank Lloyd Wright, because this is one of his transitional periods. So as he's going and learning about and becoming, the Prairie School architect, this is, the sort of bootleg period, or right after he left Louis Sullivan's shop. Now, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, important architecture. This was nominated to the National Register of Historic Places, and the nomination was denied. And why it was denied was because the siding has been changed on the exterior of the home. Now, I would say the siding, this is, I think, aluminum siding, everybody. So underneath, we believe that the existing siding is there. So if they remove the siding, then it's eligible. But what I would say is you all had a sense that this is an important place. It still tells its story, even if the siding is changed. We can still tell the story of preservation without everything being perfect. So it's shocking when I talk with people around the country that a Frank Lloyd Wright property is denied National Register status in Illinois. This is a second story. Now this is the Sheldon Peck homestead in Lombard. Some of you know it. Sheldon Peck was an itinerant painter. He himself has made critical contributions to folk painting. But a couple of things. Number one, who is his wife? You don't know because her name isn't there, right? His wife was actually part of the couple, and her name is not associated with this historically at all. It's Sheldon and Harriet Peck. And Sheldon and Harriet Peck were abolitionists. This is a spot that is on the Underground Railroad to Freedom Trail. It is a legitimate Underground Railroad site that has been proven. And as you can see, I mean, this building has changed over time. You can sort of see the additions. But it was nominated as well to the National Register and denied. Because it has those additions, it's been claimed that you can no longer understand the historic integrity of the home. Now, what are we losing? What are we missing? By not having this on the National Register, we don't have any kinds of protections for this building because Lombard doesn't have a local designation that I know of here. So this is that culture preciousness. We say just because something has changed, you can't understand the history any longer. And I would say that we can. We're smarter than that. We can tell the story. We can interpret our history. That's what historical societies do. What are we losing in the bigger picture when we make it so specific to the fact that this home, you can't tell because the siding has been changed? And I would say if it's been here since 1836, it's probably has been changed over time. So you're not going to go back and restore and remove everything that's happened since 1836 to this place. Furthermore, even those who have homes that they want to preserve can't access some of the tools, like the landmarking process or the National Register, because their history was not documented. So not everybody's history is written about. If we went to the archives of the Historical Society, you might not find things about Black history in Edgewater, or Jewish history in Edgewater, or women's history in Edgewater, because they weren't written about in our primary sources. So this is an example, once again, women's history and Black history being essentially erased from the story. Do you know this building? Yes. Yes. The famous Clark House, which was picked up and moved over the railroad tracks, the oldest. Yes.
Actually, my late husband, who had a contract with the city, was a photographer. He filmed the moving of the Widow Clark's house.
Thank you. So for those, we have somebody in the audience whose husband filmed it being moved up and over the tracks. It was an amazing engineering resource to save what is called the oldest house in Chicago.
No.
That's debatable. Some people debate that. But I just want to say that this is called the Widow Clark House. That's typically how it's known. Widow. She doesn't even have a name, a first name. She's called Mrs. Clark, essentially. So Caroline Clark was her name, actually owned this house much, much longer than her husband, Henry. He died right away. So she was the longest owner, and if you think we name things after the longest owner, she was just called Widow Clark. Actually, the longest owner of this home were the Bishop Ford and the Church of God in Christ, St. Paul's Church of God in Christ. They protected this home, they bought it to preserve it, and had it for about 40 years and preserved it, and then gave it to the city so that the city had this resource. They're not seen, they're about one paragraph in the history of this landmark. So their story, as the longest owner, was essentially absent. So thanks to work from historian Elizabeth Blasius and Kevin Ford, the grandson of Bishop Ford, now we were able to rename this at the city. It's now the Henry and Caroline Clark and Bishop Henry and Margaret Ford House. That's a long name. So it's just now called the Clark Ford House, essentially, we call it. So just making sure everybody is recognized in this. It's not just one person's history. There's a lot of layers of history that we can recognize, and it should be recognized. And I put this up because you may say, oh, you know, this we're doing a much better job of that. This is the statistic. This statistic was put together in 2014, so it's gotten better, but not significantly better. 8% of the 90,000 National Register properties in the nation tell the story of women, people of color, and the LGBTQIA+ together, combined. So women, we make up 52% or 51% of the population, and we're missing, essentially. People of color are about 40% of the nation and growing. And the LGBTQIA+ community is about 13% of the population, and they're just largely missing from the record of what places are most important in our nation. This is an example of one, thankfully, that was recognized, and I use it to also talk about this idea of justice. So if you look at this, you'd probably say, yeah, great Victorian home, right? Beautiful Victorian home. The reason it's a National Historic Landmark is because of Henry Gerber. Henry Gerber was the first to start an organization, a human rights organization in the nation for gay rights. So he wrote a newsletter here for the Society of Human Rights, and he was arrested for his work. He was removed from this place and arrested, and his typewriter, where he actually typed up the newsletter, was confiscated by the police. So this is a National Historic Landmark because of its association with gay rights. You would never see that from outside. You can't see history. We need to tell history. We are the interpreters of history. That is the role of the Historical Society. But I just want to say that when we do windshield surveys, which you've probably seen, the orange-rated, red-rated, green-rated buildings, those the Chicago Historic Resources Survey, that's just what you see on the outside. That doesn't tell us what the history or these stories are. So we have a lot of work to do to go back and tell the stories of places, because we're missing things that are important in history if we don't look at the record. This is another example of this home. You might look and say that's a nondescript Chicago home, but it's a tremendously important associated with the legal rights of people to own property. This is artist Tanika Lewis Johnson. You might have heard of her folded map project, which was part of Edgewater, was included in that. She has a project called Inequity for Sale. That was her secondary project, which identified those who were subject to land sale contracts. What that was essentially illegal theft of property from Black families, predominantly in Inglewood and North Lawndale in the 1950s. Duke University did essentially an evaluation of the loss of value for people in Black families. That was $4 billion was stolen from Black families through this practice. There's an excellent video about land sale contracts and what they mean you can watch. But essentially this home tells that story. But when she tried to landmark the number of homes in Inglewood that were associated with this, the Landmarks Commission said no, there aren't two criteria that are met by this. So what she did was essentially created her own landmarkers. So that's what you see here is essentially signage that tells the story, because she didn't have access to landmark designation. So not everybody has access to the tools that they want to save places. That's about creating a just preservation system. I'm also going to talk very quickly about our opportunity through housing. This is probably a better known example, although, all right, how many of you like this project? No one's raising their hands. Okay, all right. So this is where sometimes we compromise on the perfection of preservation versus trying to make sure we get what a community needs, which is more affordable housing. Some of you know this is on Olive Street. The homes in this neighborhood are about $1 million now. It is not a very affordable place to live any longer. So this created at least more housing options. So the former Edgewater Hospital is essentially helping to create housing which the nation, every nation, the rural communities, suburban and urban, all have an affordable housing problem. Access to affordable housing is a crisis everywhere. So preservation is a wonderful way to address this because adaptive reuse, and I'll show you like schools, for example. This is the West Pullman Elementary School, was originally what? A school. So when we convert it to housing, which is an excellent reuse, easy reuse of our closed CPS schools, we actually add to the overall supply of affordable housing. We create more units because this wasn't built as housing. So this is easier. Reusing existing buildings, you can get it to market faster, and it's cheaper than a new building, actually, when you look at the time span. So reuse is a very valuable project to developers. So we need to continue to promote how adaptive reuse is going to help with affordable housing. And if we want places to be reused anyway. These are our 4+1s, right? The famous Chicago 4+1. Everybody, when I did all my research, they hate them. People hate them, but they're really important housing. Because have you ever heard of naturally occurring affordable housing? NOAA, it's called naturally occurring affordable housing. 75% of all of the naturally occurring affordable housing, 12 million units that are accessible to people around the country, are in older buildings, just like this. We are responsible, when I say those of us who really want to see the reuse of buildings, we are responsible for 75% of the affordability in this country, essentially. So preservation has a role to play, because we can make the claim that just saving places, reinvesting in places, is about protecting affordability as well. So that's a claim, that's something we can talk about with our elected officials, that preservation is about affordable housing. And we need to keep them affordable by maintaining them, but also not seeing developers come and completely transitioning them to high scale or high value housing. And when I say that, it's because these are very vulnerable to flippers. Flippers who come and buy them at a very average price and then redo the entire thing, and then now they're high rent. So this is a critical area of affordability where preservation can have additional value to more people, be relevant to more people, talking about housing, talking about climate, talking about justice and equity, and fighting climate change. Greenest building is the one that already is built. But there's some information to tell you about that, because we have a lot of work to do to make our historic buildings more energy efficient and climate friendly. So 40% of the world's greenhouse gases comes from the buildings sector. This is not, you might say, I need to work on my grammar. It is the buildings sector, because it's both construction and operation of buildings. In Chicago, that's 68%. So our buildings are energy suckers, some of those big ones, and especially the 1950s, 60s, 70s curtain wall buildings. They use a lot of energy. But saving them is still reuse, it's still viable. I want to give you the scale though, the scale of what we're talking about in Chicago and across the United States as far as the sustainability of our existing buildings. So this is Humboldt Park, right? You probably recognize it with our beautiful boulevards. Chicago has about 550,000 buildings, everybody. 90% of those are over 60 years old. So think about the scale of opportunity we have to create accessibility and environmental friendliness, and that's a way to add value to those homeowners who now see us as providing something that they need and that they want. There are 112 million buildings around the United States, and the majority of them, the average is about 50 years. So we have a lot of work to do to ensure we can sustain them. And there's things that we can do that people can't see, right? If you want to protect the exterior, you want to protect the look of it, we can do things like doing insulation. Insulation, number one, is a great way to find more energy efficiency. Air sealing, on the other side, you can just seal up the cracks, and that provides a great deal of energy efficiency. That doesn't touch anything on the outside, if you can think about historic districts. And by the way, of those 500,000 buildings, 550,000 buildings, only 3% of them are landmarked. So we have a lot we can do to 93% of the, or 97% of the housing without ever touching a historic district. And we need to adapt before it's forced upon us. So this is in California. It's in a historic district in Los Angeles, where in California there's a proposition that essentially allows people to add solar panels as of right. They don't have to go through landmark district review because they see this as such a crisis. And what I'd say is that we can add solar panels and they can be removed. They're reversible. That's within our own Secretary of the Interior standards. So we need to think differently about how we look at historic properties, because this is making it more energy efficient and cheaper for people to live in historic buildings. And that way they'll stay in them and they'll use them. So this is key. Finally, okay, everybody's favorite, the Thompson Center. Yeah. So we worked for years to save the Thompson Center, and actually the argument I think that resonated with people the most, because the design, some people hate the design of the Thompson Center. I love it, but it was really the sustainability aspect of it, that reusing this, if we had thrown it away, we estimated about 100 million pounds of reusable material would have gone in the landfill. That would have been an environmental crisis. There's right now the proposal to demolish a building right next to the Sears Tower, Willis Tower, that is about 40 stories. Environmental disaster when you think about all that material that could be reused. So yes, we are seeing essentially the recladding of the Thompson Center, but it needed to be more energy efficient. It was not energy efficient, and people hated working there because it was not a pleasant place to work. So this is still a preservation success story. And if we don't do this, this is what we have to look forward to, of course. And I put this up, so this is, for example, Lahaina. The historic district in Lahaina completely destroyed. Phoenix on your top right, which has had essentially 100 days over 115 degrees last year. Asheville, North Carolina, where the historic district's washed away with floods. Los Angeles, which we just saw the complete destruction of Pacific Palisades and other historic districts. So the effects of climate change, we can help mitigate them by doing these things for historic buildings. But not only that, everybody, there are right now...
It's a hoax.
There are about 21 million people who are displaced by climate emergencies and disasters. That number is expected to be 1 billion people by 2050. So that's temporary and permanent, people who have to move from where they are to find another place to live. And that Chicago can be that, because we're a more temperate climate, becoming a more temperate climate. So we can reuse historic buildings to also house some of those refugees that are coming to Chicago. And finally, preservation is a matter of health. Well, jobs is next, but I'm rounding out. So you remember we talked about urban renewal. Of course, the highways were a key part of that. The highways were intentionally put through neighborhoods that were low resourced, like this one is the Dan Ryan going through next to the Robert Taylor homes, essentially displacing communities from their community. So even though some of these were not pleasant places to live from a physical standpoint, there was still community there. There was family, there was story. And by displacing people, by demolishing historic buildings, we displace people from the connections they have to their community. And when we do that, it actually affects us physically. It's called Root Shock is a great book that you can read by Dr. Mindy Fogelove about this displacement effects on your physical health. It's also called soul nostalgia, which is the effects of essentially being displaced on your physical and mental well-being. And we carry that in our DNA. There's studies that show when we're continuously displaced from people or places we care about, it actually is embedded in your DNA and passed down to your children. It's fascinating research, and I think there's more that we can talk about with the public health impacts positively of preservation that we don't talk about right now. Haymarket, for example, is a site of conscience. Have any of you been to the Haymarket Memorial? Yeah, so there you might have heard about the importance of labor history. So visiting that, this is a site of conscience where people died, of course, fighting for their rights to organize. So places are also important, key areas where we can have healing around difficult histories too. And a key aspect of health and well-being is choice. We all want to be able to choose what our environment is like, where we live, how we live. So I would say this is also part of the future of preservation, as we found out, is that communities want to determine for themselves what is important to them. That makes sense. Right now, architectural historians tend to be the ones that are doing that. We go around, we survey, and we say, well, that's important, that's important, that's important, but we often don't live there. So having self-determination in the landmarking process is incredibly important for people's health and well-being, community and individual. This is a positive example of that. Did any of you know this is one of our newest landmarks? The Arco de la Venita, which is built in 1991. So it is not some long historic landmark, but it's important to the community. It is designed by a Mexican architect, and it's one of the first, I think it's the first building on the landmark list that was designed by a Mexican architect. So the community said, we want this preserved, and it was important to listen to the community. And finally, we can do a lot. I mean, we just saw thousands of our federal workers laid off from the National Park Service. They're going to be looking for jobs, and we have a dearth of construction workers. Right now, they can't find enough people to do construction as there's attrition and retirement from the journeymen who are retiring. There aren't enough apprentices to take their place. We cannot preserve places without the hands to do it, without the skills to do it. And right now, we have about 90% of all contractors who say they can't find enough people to do construction. So I'd say this is a big opportunity to talk about essentially a good job in the trades right now. And there's lots of work and preservation to be done. So this is Chicago Women in the Trades. We're actually going to be honoring them next week for their work to create opportunities for women in good paying jobs in the trades. Let's continue to talk about trades as an honorable thing, an honorable work area, and bring more people in. Sir? Yes.
That's because of the 08, 09, 10 downturn. About 1 million contractors left the business. So that meant a whole nother generation that wasn't being trained as apprentices and helpers.
Thank you. So just to document that the 08-09 crisis, financial crisis, essentially many of our construction workers from the Midwest emigrated to the Southwest, Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, California, where there was still some construction that was going. We lost an entire generation of people who moved away from this area, and we haven't replaced them. This is all across the country, though, too, that we're seeing just large-scale retirements. I also want to say that we have to think about the workplaces that we create for preservationists. So this is a photo of the Landmarks Commission meeting that just happened in February 6th, and this is Gianna Cuballo, who is at the top, who is a hardworking, much like Matt Crawford. We have too few people at the Landmarks Commission, so we have, I think, 12 employees. The city of San Antonio itself has over 40 employees in their Landmarks division, and we are a much bigger city than that. So imagine their workload and what they have to do on a daily basis. The burnout rates right now, as is measured in nonprofits, 50% of people who work for nonprofits claim that they are burned out. That number is 65% for public workers. So I think we need to be compassionate, and we have to do what we can to help them, do the work to assist them, because they're there trying to preserve places with us and for us. So I just wanted to call out that the mental health issues and burnout is real. And we have to think about how to support preservationists who are doing this work professionally. With that, that's very high level for those several of those 8. I didn't even cover all of the 8, but I hope I've covered enough to get you thinking and questioning. And some of you want to, I'm sure, give me your thoughts on this. I want to hear them. This is a conversation we're having around the country. I've been able to speak as a keynote speaker now in 8 states. So about over 1,000 people have had conversations about this and these ideas. So I would say with the time, how much time do we have, John?
I'd say a good half hour.
Half hour? Ooh. Do you want me to keep talking? Okay. All right, yeah.
It only needs
right.
to be as lengthy as it needs to be.
So we have more time for, I hope, a robust conversation. And to the extent that we can make this a space where you can, please say anything that you want to. I have heard it all. And I'm just going to put up and get to you just a second. That here are those 8 areas. If you want to reference them, I'm going to keep this slide up, but we have time things up. So this project was also about gathering data. Throughout the publication, there are data points that communities can use to actually make these legitimate claims, back them up. We have the resources there. Kathy, I think about the Edgewater Historical Society members. As John said, this is one of the. I see you, ma'am. I will get to you. Thank you. You're one of the most active groups of advocates in our city. So I would say that it's continuing activism, continuing organizing about the places that are important. And if that's getting nowhere, Kathy, then again, how can we sit down and think about other partners? What we find is that building coalitions of partners outside of preservation is sometimes the most effective strategy. Housing advocates, climate change advocates, artists. There was I don't know if any of you remember, about 3 years ago, there was an ordinance that was proposed which affected the Edgewater Historical Society to essentially no longer allow community museums to be in residential districts. If you remember this, Alderman King had proposed that. There are museums in residential districts across the city, and the claim was that they were detrimental in some way, parking, noise, and of course not. These are community resources. So we, the preservationists, joined with the artist community and the museum public history community to have a force of a coalition, and that was very effective. So I also think about coalitions too. We can talk in far more depth if you want to about strategies and ideas, but those are the ones I think of immediately. Is that helpful, Kathy? Or sort of helpful. That's okay.
They're never going to rebuild Lakeshore Drive in our lifetime, so don't worry.
Yes, ma'am.
As members of the Burger Park Advisory Council, we are very, very interested in retaining the art that great architecture provides to us, and we're about to start a fundraising campaign to open up Gunder House, which is the North Mansion, to the public, which not only is an artistic value, but there will be programs and things in the mansion that will benefit the community as well.
So the comment is about Burger Park. We have two, again, very important and few remaining of what Sheridan used to be, which was a residential district with single-family homes along. And as it's densified, there are fewer and fewer of those sort of vestiges of that past of Sheridan Road. So the idea is to start a fundraising campaign to open the North House, Gunder House. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And contribute and add to the opportunities people have to visit and use those places. Was that a comment? Is there a question that you have, ma'am?
Well, we're looking for all the help we can get. That's my question. And of course, we will be looking to contacting you as well as people from the Historical Society.
Yes, and I'm going to come back to this so that it's there for you, but in the end of the presentation is all of my contact information, our contact information. I see, I'm welcome. Our landmarks.org, as John said, we were very lucky. That was our board member, Jean Follett, who locked that in like the 1990s to get landmarks.org. And very easy to remember, though. Why I say that is we have a resource page. So we have a really robust, thank you, John, for saying our website is very robust, I would agree. And there's a page on grant resources, for example. Landmarks Illinois is a grantor. So we raise money at this 700-person event I just talked about. We actually raise money to give it back out. So we have 3 grant funds where we can make small seed grants, and we do all across the city and the state. And oftentimes those seed grants go and link to bigger grants. Like the one I'm going to mention is the Muddy Waters House. Some of you may have heard about the effort to save the Muddy Waters House in Bronzeville. And there we gave one of the first seed grants and helped actually write a funding case statement with Chandra Cooper, the great-granddaughter of Muddy Waters. And thankfully, through her wonderful advocacy in the board, they've now raised over $2 million. So that seed grant can sometimes be a great start for enabling other grantors to make gifts. So go to our website under the resources page. There are all those grant resources. But you can certainly talk to me as well. Yes.
Oh, if we want to refer other people to the YouTube recording of this presentation, what would be the best place to look? Would it be under Landmarks Illinois?
We'll have it on our
On the
website as
Edgewater?
well.
Okay.
So the question was where to find this recording on YouTube so that it can be shared, and it will be on the Edgewater Historical Society's website, YouTube page, essentially.
On that topic, I just want to point out also that talk that Tom Green and I gave back in early December, talking about all the historic buildings on Broadway, is on our website as well. We're doing a much better job, thanks to great volunteers, of recording our programs and preserving them for future audiences. So if you want to see the talk we had on all the noteworthy buildings on Broadway, you can find it on our homepage. There's a link on our homepage, edgewaterhistory.org.
So a plug for the Edgewater Historical Society website for all things Edgewater. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
My question is just kind of technical or procedural. In your talk, you mentioned one of the homes that failed to receive historic landmark designation because they didn't meet 2 of the criteria. My understanding, because we've been sort of doing this for 10 years very slowly, is that you only have to meet 1, because we submitted initially an application under 2, and it came back saying, no, just do 1. Is that correct?
Well, let me say that yes and no, not to be cagey, but yes and no. So yes, you are correct for National Register designation. You only need to meet 1 of the criteria. For Chicago Landmark designation, you must meet 2 of the 7 criteria. So the effort by Tanika Lewis Johnson was to essentially create what we call a multiple property district. That's a non-contiguous district. So usually historic districts are, they have a sort of boundary that's consistent in a neighborhood. A multiple property is when you have lots of disparate, scattered, important places that are connected by a theme or a story. And so there she was trying to create a local landmark district, and according to the person she talked to from the commission, they did not believe it would meet 2 criteria. So that's just the difference between the National Register and the local landmark district.
And it's 2 of 7?
2 of 7 criteria that you must meet for local designation. In Chicago, I'll just note that it's different, that ordinance is different in different cities. So I'm just referencing Chicago.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, hi. Just a couple of quick questions. So a light bulb went off when you said Bishop Ford. I'm actually kind of new. Well, was new here, but I still never knew what Bishop Ford, the highway.
Yes.
So is that the Bishop Ford? Is the highway named after Bishop Ford?
Yeah. Thank you. Great question about the history. When I moved here, I also did not. Who's Dan Ryan? Who's Bishop Ford? You just, when you're new to a community, you don't know these things. Then Jane Addams, circle. So I know Jane Addams, of course, but Jane Byrne. So the Bishop Ford, the highway, ironically, that went through Bronzeville, is named after Bishop Ford of St. Paul's Church of God in Christ. Yes. So the person who saved the Clark House and preserved it through that congregation, but the highway ran right through the South Side neighborhood. They named it after him. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Question number 2. Thank you. You mentioned that there were 550,000 buildings in Chicago that were over 6 years old. Are those the commercial and residential buildings, or? Yeah.
Yes, and I'm referencing here the exact numbers are in a study that we did with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Urban Land Institute. There was an initiative in 2016 called the Partnership for Building Reuse. And this was a study done in a couple cities around the country to understand why weren't people able to reuse buildings? What was preventing that from happening? Was it regulatory? Was it financial? Was it something logistical, physical? And that study is very helpful. It comes out with a number of recommendations. But essentially, in order to understand that, the National Trust an amazing economist who did a heat map to understand how many buildings we have and how old they were. And it was amazing to find out, yes, we have over 500,000 buildings in Chicago, at least at that time in 2016, and that the majority of them were built prior to 1960. So again, it was 90% of them were built before 1960.
Okay, third time, last time. Can we get preservation is affordable housing on a t-shirt?
Yes, let's go over to the t-shirt deli and we'll make that t-shirt today. Yes, so we need a t-shirt. Preservation is affordable housing. So again, I just want to comment that it's, there's subsidized affordable housing, two kinds in the United States largely. We have public housing, which is subsidized, and then we have those that use the low-income housing tax credits, which are subsidized. And then there's unsubsidized, naturally occurring affordable housing. All of these are opportunities for preservation. And again, if you want to talk to people about something that means something to them, home and housing is key. We all need a home, and housing is a human right. So we can help to provide that. Thank you for those good questions. Yes, sir.
You didn't talk about one of the things you're up against when you're trying to preserve something is usually there is somebody with a lot of money at stake that is wanting to tear this down so they can make money.
So the question was, I did not talk about what we are often up against, which is a developer. We'll use the word. There's somebody who has resources, who's looking to make resources from real estate, essentially. And again, pragmatically, being in this field as long as I have, preservation is real estate. And it's hard to admit that, but we have to understand how real estate works to do this work effectively. How do incentives work? How do the regulatory environment work? So I would say that it's very common and easy to blame it on the developers, but they're not all made the same. And I would say we need developers to reuse places. We need people with resources to reinvest and reuse places. So let's be careful about lumping everybody together. Because I showed you the West Pullman Elementary School, which was reused by a developer. We're talking about the Edgewater Hospital, which was reused that existing building. I mean, the hospital could have been torn down. A good portion of it was, but they reused a part of it. That was a developer who did reuse that history for us still to be there. Old Cook County Hospital was developer John Murphy. So the old post office, largest preservation project in the country, largest federal historic preservation project in the country, developer. So we're not always up against, and it's making I think a reasoned argument for reuse, adaptive reuse or reuse of a place if we can. Is that always the case where we're going to have a friendly ear and someone who sees the value of what we're talking about? No, absolutely not. And then we just have to be as savvy as we can to to organize and to ensure that we can make the case to those who are making the decisions. That may not be, I don't know if that answered your question, but I would say, many times we're working with people who want to reuse places and they see the value of that.
Helping them understand the value in redevelopment and repurposing existing buildings is the challenge.
Yes. Thank you, John. I saw some other hands. Yes, sir.
I know that religious affiliations have certain protections against landmarking, and we're losing some of them. I mean, Our Lady of Lourdes just down the street on Ashland is being picked away piece by piece by piece. Does your organization have any influence in helping to preserve some of these religious buildings? I mean, we're in one right here, and if this neighbor gets rezoned, they could come down and get an 8-story building here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So the question was about really our ability as Landmarks Illinois, but collectively as a community of preservationists to influence the future of our religious spaces, our sacred places. A couple ideas that I want to share with you. Number one, I mentioned that we have significant grant resources that we raise. the majority of those that are coming in for grants are faith-based communities. They are struggling, really struggling with the changing nature of how people practice faith, right? This is a practical reality is that people just don't necessarily practice in the same way, go to these places. There's the diminishment of people who, would associate themselves with a faith in the United States as well. So one thing is that we have to see the reality of that and find opportunities to reuse if we can. Now, that is really difficult and challenging for those who practiced in that place, like St. Adalbert, for example, you might have heard of, which was deconsecrated by the Catholic Church, and there's a developer who does want to reuse it and build housing next to it. So it doesn't mean that it's without controversy and pain to reuse places that were once associated with something so critical to identity. There we have to say, are we looking at just the bricks and mortar? Are we looking at just reusing the thing? As a climate aspect, yes, but the heart is gone in many ways, the heart of that place. So we have grant resources. I see you, ma'am. I'll come to you next. We have grant resources. We work with an organization called Partners for Sacred Places, which is solely focused on sacred places and reusing them. And then we're trying to continually build the capacity to get to the decision makers within these organizations that decide, like the Archdiocese of Chicago, which has proposed demolishing 100 churches, Catholic churches around the city.
Yeah.
Frankly, we have to get in and have those conversations and make the case for value and be willing to compromise, all of the things I've talked about today. And it's challenging because not every place will be saved, most likely. So how do you pick and choose when they're so critical to people's idea, memory, faith, identity? Yeah. No easy answers, I'm afraid.
I mean, christenings, births, deaths, weddings.
Yes.
You want to talk about the heart of the community? A lot of these facilities are.
Yes. And with that in mind, and I think this is the conversation to continue to have, because there was I think it was a former Protestant church, if I remember, in Logan Square, which was reused as a circus academy because of the open space design, right? Really creative reuse. And we would see in preservation terms, success, because it was reused, but it also is no longer associated with that, those memories you talked about. So is it a success? And these are the critical questions to be asked, is like, what are we preserving? And if it is the heart, then that was not a success if it's no longer associated necessarily. But reusing it as a sustainable practice, that's a success. There's no one answer, I'm afraid. But thank you for bringing up the question, because this is going to be a crisis. It's coming crisis in the city. It's already here, in fact.
I mean, we can thank our Muslim community here for saving Epworth.
Yes, we can thank the Ismaili Center and others for reusing places. There's the Majid Iznur, which reused, I think, an existing church, what had been a church, possibly. And then I live near the Eritrean, Catholic community that reused a church, small community church. So absolutely. And don't forget, there are religious communities that are reusing abandoned storefronts for faith-based practices. That's reuse. That's reuse as well. So, yes, ma'am, you had a hand.
Yeah, I do. Epworth Church went from Methodist to Muslim, thanks to EHS. But is there any data or numbers on the waste stream when you demo a building? What C&D, is it all going? I know C&D can't go to the landfill, but any figures on that we can use?
One aggregated number for demolition happening, no. For example, I don't think that's what you're asking for, but I just wanted to say, is there somebody tracking all of demolitions? Not that I know of, but there was just the creation of an incredible tool that was launched to essentially help people estimate the demolition waste. And if they reuse something, so doing a very data-driven analysis of the value of reuse or demolition.
Yes.
Just looking at it without, very analytically.
Yeah.
So it's, we've got it, it's in the guidebook. goodness, now y'all, I need more coffee, I guess. It's the acronym for it starts with a C, and I'm so sorry to the developers, but I can share it with all of you. I can send it later if John wants to post it, because it's a wonderful tool where you can put in essentially the building material, the square footage, the scale, and it will estimate the amount of material that is going to be wasted. So that's what we've been waiting for a long time.
Great.
Yes.
Okay.
John?
Yeah, just a couple things. I think it was 4 weeks ago today that we had that meeting about Broadway over at the Edgewater Library. Unfortunately, one of our coalition members working on Broadway preservation is Jack Markowski, who used to be the housing commissioner for the city. And then he became the head of CIC, which is the biggest affordable housing funder in Chicago. So Jack is really, he should write about 3 or 4 books. He's a font of information on how preserving existing buildings is so much more cost efficient than building new quote unquote subsidized housing. The Tribune just had a big editorial a few weeks ago saying the average cost of a affordable housing unit in Chicago, if it's new construction, is somewhere in the vicinity of $800,000 or $900,000 a unit, which is crazy. I've had these conversations with Jack for a couple of years now, and I said, geez, whoever wrote that editorial must have been reading your mind, Jack. So CIC funds basically the acquisition and redevelopment of buildings, and their average unit cost for 1 and 2 bedroom units is $110,000 versus $900,000 for new development. So that just tells the story right there that the most ecological and affordable buildings are the ones that are already existing. One other question, though, out of that program we had at the library on Broadway 4 weeks ago, Jonathan Fine, the founder of Preservation Chicago, was in the audience, and he tipped me off during that program that the controversy on Broadway is upzoning, and the main argument is that we have an affordable housing crisis. The corridor runs right along the Red Line, which has been is in the final stages of being renovated. We all know CTA ridership is down for a variety of reasons. The mindset on the upzoning is that this will help cure the ails of the CTA ridership situation, which to me seems like a bit of an attenuated reason, but Jonathan mentioned there's this kind of controversy or tension between preservation and affordable housing development, and he noted that there were 2 examples in the city of Chicago where there was significant upzoning done in tandem with creating a landmark district. One was the Motor Road district out on South Michigan Avenue, and the other was the Fulton Market district, which is about 15 years old now. And since then, the woman who was the head of landmarks for the city, who quarterbacked that, is another great woman in preservation in Chicago, Eleanor Gorski, who's now the head of the Chicago Architecture Center. So I've been in touch with her, and we've had a couple conversations about possible ways to try to get these 2 things working together. So again, the Alderman's office has opened the door for exploring a possible Broadway landmark district, maybe to be done in tandem with the Bryn Mawr district, and the 2 obviously intersect. A couple questions though for Bonnie. I don't know, are there any, outside of Fulton Market or the 2 I just mentioned, can you think of any districts in not only Chicago but anywhere, in the metro area or nationally, that really kind of exemplify smart, savvy development in conjunction with a landmarking effort? Or maybe we're the example waiting to happen.
Well, so the question of landmarking as a tool, it's a very limited tool, everyone. It's not really a comprehensive land use tool. So it is most effective when landmarking is done in conjunction with a larger planning effort. So that it's comprehensive, it's community-led, and it's very thoughtful about the future. That's what land use planning is meant to do. My example, which we have worked with Eleanor on all of those when she was in that position, The landmark district in Fulton Market, for example, is very innovative in Chicago, only of its kind, which allowed for the addition of one story on historic buildings, recognizing that people reusing them need market capacity. They need to have that extra floor to have the square footage to pay for the renovation oftentimes. And that industrial buildings were added onto all the time. It's part of the character. So actually it doesn't diminish them to have that extra space. I think with that level of creativity, we can do a lot if we think about districts in a creative capacity this way. So that's one example. That was a sort of reaction to the development that was happening in the Fulton Market District very rapidly. The one that I think about which did not go well was the Pilsen Historic District. And the Pilsen District was meant to be part of really a comprehensive approach to thinking about displacement and gentrification in Pilsen. And that was happening for people and it was happening for businesses, so economically as well as socially as well. The landmark district was the first thing proposed. It was not meant to be. It was actually really to be the last. There was supposed to be a housing initiative that preceded it, and also I think business development work. But because it was seen as this regulatory tool, there was a great reaction against the concern about the inability for people to change their homes and the cost of doing any work to their home if it had to meet landmark standards. So this is what I want to say is that landmark districts, part of it is about the perception people have and versus the reality of what it means. But also having flexibility is going to be key because we live in an organic, cities are like organisms. They grow and they change with people's needs. And the more that we're thoughtful and flexible and see people's needs, the more preservation will be accepted as an important solution to have at the table. So with the Broadway district, I think a sort of, solution is that there's a lot of open space, right? You think about the parking lots, vacant lots. That should be where we go first with our housing and density, is reuse the vacant land and then have conversations about what we can do to reuse or, hopefully invest in the existing places to make them more amenable. Like, we have a lot of vacant retail, don't we, folks? Yeah. If you think about it, on Clark Street, lots of vacant retail space. We should be transitioning that to housing. It should become affordable housing. There's a pilot project that ULI, Urban Land Institute, did here in Chicago to transition vacant first-story retail into affordable housing. Very effective reuse strategy. So, instead of going right to demolition, what are the options that we have to be effective? And it may not be a preservation argument we're making, it may be a speed argument, it may be a cost argument. As John just said, I brought this one, I'll come back to you. I brought this photo back up to tell you again the cost of preservationists being so focused on perfection. Because this is an example, West Pullman, that was successfully reused low-income housing tax credits. Because the Illinois Housing Development Authority has the responsibility to allocate low-income housing development tax credits. They perceive preservation is too expensive because that cost per unit count is all that matters to them. So if you can build two less well-built but fast $400,000 two units for one preservation unit that's $800,000, they feel their responsibility is to create the two units, not the one. Even though there are so many benefits to reusing that building from a health and wellness standpoint, better quality, longevity of resources. But I wanted to tell you it's real because they award points for projects that come asking for these credits. And because of their perceived disadvantages of preservation, they removed the point that you got for reusing an existing building. So now those who are trying to do this are at a disadvantage over those who are doing stick-built new
Who made that
development.
decision? That was
Illinois Housing Development Authority. So that's why I say there are consequences to coming at this and thinking, because the reason it can cost more is because we require them to keep so much of the material or restore so much of the material. So what is the advantage to doing that when you can save a lot of things, but it's not going to be perfection, and you provide somebody with a housing unit? That's an example of the ramifications of some of these decisions that are made.
Can I just make one other
Sure.
note about Edgewater? I suspect, and I don't know if we'll ever get around to actually studying it, but this area of central Edgewater between Broadway and Clark, Foster and Devon, I believe is probably the oldest and most intact part of Chicago. There are only a handful of buildings that have been taken down. The new Edgewater Glen district that was just created, which is a really substantial amount of territory. I forget exactly how many buildings are in it, maybe 1,500, 2,000. But they had 97% compliance, 3% what they call non-contributing buildings. That is the buildings that aren't original to the land. So maybe we need to do a better job of getting that message out there. It's often the case. I've been involved in preservation efforts around Chicago and Edgewater, and before I lived up here in Uptown. Your batting average is usually pretty low in saving buildings, and even if there's an all-out community effort, it's sometimes an uphill battle. But we've had a number of successes over the years, and EHS over the years has had a number of successes as well. So we're hoping to add to it with Broadway, and the more we can educate our elected officials on that, I think the better.
Well, thank you. I was just going to, and I think you're going to be probably our last question, sir. I just was going to remark that, these conversations can be difficult because we're very passionate about the places that we hear about a story, about a place, about architecture, whatever reasons you care about places and want to save them. So taking some of these things into consideration, it's important just to hear what other people are saying. And I say that because we found this to be an effective strategy. We have helped save 26,000 places across the state in our history. And that's because we're willing to come to the table with some compromises if we need to. That's difficult. It's difficult to make the case to our preservation community sometimes, but it's about the bigger picture of what we can save instead of losing so much by looking at only the material and trying to be perfect about our solutions. So that's, I think, hopefully a case to be made for listening to others and coming to the table with